Welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Over the past few weeks, we have been studying the laws concerning sexuality, marriage, inheritance. This week, we are going to begin in marriage. So we've covered all the laws concerning sexuality. Now we're moving on to marriage. And before we get into our material today, I want to preface this whole thing by saying that I am going to take a mostly descriptive approach to the material. All right, so we're going to look at things as they were in antiquity and as they are regulated in the Law of Moses. So we're going to be talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. But what you hear today, and probably in the next couple of weeks, is not meant to be prescriptive, meaning that we're not talking about things as they should be. Right. When I describe something that the Law of Moses says, or something that was happening in antiquity, that is not my way of saying this is good and right behavior, and people are just fine acting this way today. Right. That's a necessary distinction, I think, for a couple of reasons. First off, it's a biblical distinction. Right. Whenever the Pharisees ask Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, they start with this question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? The short answer is no. Right, and so the Pharisees ask then, well, why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send the woman away, right? Send his ex-wife away. And Jesus' answer is, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Right? Jesus draws a distinction between what the law of Moses allowed and what actually should be done. Right, the way things should be, what is actually true and good. Remember, the law of Moses is not just a set of religious laws, it's also a set of civil laws. And what we find is that God, very often in the law of Moses, condescends to Israel in their context. Right, and this is similar, by the way, to what Paul says in Athens, that God has condescended to the pagan world in their context. Right, he says these times of ignorance God formerly overlooked. All right, and it's not just true of the pagan world, it's also true of Israel. Again, Jesus tells us that explicitly. Right, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts, but from the beginning it was not so. All right, so by necessity, whenever we are describing what happens in antiquity, what happens in the law of Moses, we are not describing the way things should be. Now, don't be tempted to see this as an inconsistency on God's part, by the way. The proper name for this is mercy. And as we will see, marriage laws are fertile soil for teaching Israel about God's mercy. Now, the second reason that I want to draw this distinction right here at the outset is that in my experience, people tend to lose their minds when we start talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. I think I've seen it in this topic more than in any other topic that we talk about anywhere in the Bible. Right? Just let it be known now, at the outset, I am not laying out a systematic theology of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. That's its own class. Right, we've been studying the law of Moses for 1.5 years now. We could be studying this for another 5 years if I decided to take the time to give a systematic understanding of every single topic that we look at in the law. We're interested just in what the law says and what's going on in the ancient world. So, all that being said, let's go ahead and look and see how the ancient Near East handled marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Now, of course, as our course of study is going to follow the normal course of a marriage relationship in the ancient world. So we're going to start this week by talking about interest and eligibility. What is it that makes someone eligible for marriage? What kinds of things are people looking for in a marriage partner in the ancient world? Then we will look at betrothal and its requirements. Then we'll look at marriage itself and some of the laws regulating that, including laws about adultery. And finally, we will look at divorce and the possibility of remarriage in the law of Moses and in the ancient world in general. So let's start with eligibility. Why do people get married in the ancient world? Let's start, just as a point of reference, let's start with marriage in the modern West. A lot of things have changed, but some things have stayed pretty much the same through all of human history. Most marriages in the modern West take place in a liberal context, meaning that all parties involved have pretty much unlimited free choice. And these relationships usually begin with mutual attraction, right? So, you've got, again, pretty much limitless choices. That's why we use metaphors like, fish in the sea, right? If a relationship doesn't work out, we'll say, oh, there are other fish in the sea. You know how many fish there are in the sea, right? If you go fishing out in the ocean, what kinds of options you have. We're talking billions of animals there. And that kind of metaphor for marriage only makes sense in a liberal society where you have, again, unlimited choice. You could go literally anywhere in this country and marry literally anyone. And so if those are your options, how do you got to narrow them down a little bit. How do you narrow them down? Well, in the modern West, it begins almost always with mutual attraction, right? Whether we're talking personality or sexuality, usually a combination of both, right? You like something about the other person's personality, and they also kind of get you going. All of this process leading to betrothal in the modern West centers around romance. Right, that's just the general descriptive term that we give to the whole process of coming to know the other person and, becoming more and more interested in settling down with this person and having children with this person. Now, a lot of that, the romance, the attraction-based first, primarily on physical attractiveness and personality. Most of that is, and especially the unlimited free choice, that stuff is more or less alien to antiquity, unless you are at really the top of the pecking order, right? It's only kings who marry women primarily for their looks and for their personality. And it's only kings who have basically unlimited free choice in the ancient world. But returning to modern relationships, if you dig beneath the romance element of it, you will almost always find the same set of interests that led the ancients to marry as well. All right, women in general, and again, I should stress, in general, I'm not talking about every woman who has ever lived, but women in general have sought men who will give them and their children security. And this has always been generally true in human history. Right? Women are looking for men who will give them protection and provision, again, both for themselves and for their children. Men, in general, have always sought women who will give them, and only them, children, sexual access, in order to pass on an inheritance. Right? So men throughout history are generally looking both for fertility and for chastity at the same time, and they're interested in raising legitimate heirs. These kinds of things have never changed. Right? In those ways, people in the ancient world are very similar to us today, except that those interests are more explicit, right? And more the legal aspects of marriage are bound up in protecting those interests explicitly. All right, we'll see these interests come out in the laws about betrothal, about marriage, about divorce, about remarriage. In the laws, there's a focus on the man's providing wealth for the woman, and the woman's providing children and exclusive sexual access for the man. Right, the laws generally, and whenever I say the laws, I mean not only the law of Moses, which we'll study, but also just ancient Near Eastern law in general, which we'll also look at. These laws try to hedge against common ways in which those interests go astray. Right, so they try to protect those interests as they are expressed legitimately, and they also try to keep people from going astray in terms of those interests. Let's look at a couple of examples, just to show what we mean and how it played out in the ancient world. We'll start with the broader ancient world before we turn our attention to the law of Moses. I think this will help us understand some of the things that happen in the law of Moses, some of the things that happen in Israel's history, and especially things that happen in the time of the patriarchs, if we understand first the broader ancient context of things. This will give us a sense of Israel's cultural background. We're going to take our readings primarily from the laws of Hammurabi. Or we can find these reflected, these principles that we're going to look at. We can find them reflected in other ancient law codes as well, but Hammurabi is the most famous and most accessible. So if you want to find any of these yourselves and consult them, they're, again, pretty easy to hunt down on the internet. So let's read a little bit from the laws of Hammurabi. All right. If a man, after his father's death, should be discovered in the lap of his, that is his father's, principal wife who had borne children, that man shall be disinherited from the paternal estate. All right, let's make clear what Hammurabi is talking about here. In another place, in fact, in the law immediately preceding this one, Hammurabi specifies that if a man after his father's death is discovered in the lap of his mother, meaning, he and his mother are doing it, that both of them shall be put to death. Both of them shall be burned, I think is the consequence for that. He's not talking about the man's mother in this law. Here, when he says, if a man after his father's death should be discovered in the lap of his principal wife who had borne children, Hammurabi is talking about a woman who is not his mother. All right, the woman who is married to his father, but who is not his mother. So in other words, his stepmother. That man shall be disinherited from the paternal estate. So let's notice a few things about this law. First off, we should notice the motive. Why would this man be motivated to fornicate with his father's principal wife? A few motives, but probably the biggest one is free sex with no strings attached. Right, the widow is literally in the stepson's power, more than likely. And so he can essentially do with her as he pleases. And having sex with her does not add to his obligations. Right? In some way, he might already be obligated to her. Being a stepson, he might have to provide for her in some way already. Or if he has stepbrothers, who are her children, they have to take care of her. And that's not going to change. Right? In a lot of other situations, fornicating with a woman would create a lot of obligations for you. And we will see that reflected in the laws. We'll see it reflected in the law of Moses as well. It's a high-risk proposition to fornicate with a woman who is who's not tied down in some way, who is not being taken care of in some way, because then you become the guy who has to take care of her. In this situation, though, the widow is in the stepson's power, and having sex with her does not add to his obligations at all, like it would in other circumstances. So that's the motive. The crime, of course, is fornication, but it's aggravated by the way in which the stepson is taking advantage of his power and his stepmother's relative powerlessness. Now, you look at the punishment. The stepson is cut off. He is disinherited from the paternal estate. That means, now in an ancient context, he has practically no ability to find a legitimate wife for himself, or even to provide for himself. Right? This is like everything is taken away from him. He will receive nothing from his father. This is a steep, steep penalty in the ancient world. and it's structured to provide a hedge against the man's perverse interests by threatening his legitimate interests. All right, let's take another example. If a man provides wives for his eligible sons, but does not provide a wife for his youngest son, when the brothers divide the estate after the father goes to his fate, they shall establish the silver value of the bride wealth for the young unmarried brother from the property of the paternal estate, in addition to his inheritance share, and thereby enable him to obtain a wife. All right, so the law protects the young son's inheritance and his ability to materially provide for a wife. Right? So it's not just, they're all going to split up the estate evenly, and even though the rest of the brothers are already married, so they don't have to pay a bride price, but the youngest brother isn't married, so out of his inheritance, he's going to have to take out the bride price to pay to marry a wife. So he's going to end up, relatively speaking, compared to his brothers, impoverished. The law of Hammurabi says, no, that's not the way it's going to work. Right? That law recognizes that one of the central interests involved in an ancient marriage is providing for the wife. And one of the main ways that you demonstrate that in the ancient world is by paying the father of the bride a bride price. And that ultimately goes to the bride herself, along with the dowry. Right? So the groom-to-be and the father of the bride both provide material wealth for the bride. And that is meant as essentially insurance. If anything happens, this woman is going to be provided for. And that tells us about the central interests of women in the ancient world, and how men have to live up to that interest, have to meet that interest, and how the laws are organized to help men make that, to make that goal, to be able to handle that interest, right? So here, a young unmarried man is guaranteed a bride price along with his inheritance share if his father dies. Right, now we also see ways in which ancient laws sought to protect the interests of women. Right, and again, we saw it a little bit in protecting the inheritance and the bride price, but we can see it in some more specific ways in other places in ancient law. If a man marries a woman, and later labum disease, which probably refers to a skin disease, seizes her, and he decides to marry another woman, he may marry. He will not divorce his wife whom labum disease seized. She shall reside in quarters he constructs, and he shall continue to support her as long as she lives. All right, so again, here's the interest. The man wants to be able to have children, to have heirs. The presumption here in this law is that the woman is not able to provide heirs because of this disease. That's usually the only reason why ancient Near Eastern laws would allow you to marry a second wife, is if your first wife couldn't produce an heir for you. And so you see the man's interests upheld in the law. So he gets to marry another woman in order to produce an heir, but he doesn't get to throw his first wife out on her ear. Right? He has to construct her separate living quarters. He has to continue to support her as a wife as long as she lives. Right? So the woman is provided for and protected. She has security, and that is enshrined in ancient law. Now, finally, we can see ways in which ancient laws sought to hedge against a wayward wife's perverse interests by threatening her legitimate interests, just like we saw at the beginning, how it hedges against a man's perverse interests by threatening his legitimate interests, right? And these are just examples. Hammurabi is littered with these laws, and the other ancient Near Eastern law codes are littered with these laws. These are just samples, as it were. But let's read some more from Hammurabi. If the wife of a man who is residing in the man's house should decide to leave, and she appropriates goods, squanders her household possessions, or disparages her husband, they shall charge and convict her. And if her husband should declare his intention to divorce her, then he shall divorce her. Neither her travel expenses, nor her divorce settlement, nor anything else shall be given to her. Right? Now, this includes the dowry, which is normally transferred during a divorce. If her husband should declare his intention to not divorce her, then her husband may marry another woman, and that first woman shall reside in her husband's house as a slave woman. All right, so if a woman in ancient Mesopotamia was tempted to take the money and run, as it were, that is, receive some material provision without being locked down in a marriage, she can have everything taken away from her. Because slaves in the ancient world have basically no rights. I mean, there's, as we'll see in Hammurabi and in Moses later on in this course, whenever we talk about slavery, there are some protections in the laws for slaves, but they essentially have no rights, can't hold property generally. They generally can't engage in any kind of contracts, anything like that. And so if this woman is tempted to take the money and run, she literally loses everything, completely loses her status. Not just as first wife, but just as free citizen. And then she comes under the man's complete power. Because as we will see later on, slaves are usually taken advantage of sexually in the ancient world. All right, and so you see how the law kind of turns things back around on this woman. That she wants all of the goods of a marriage, but doesn't want to be pinned down in a marriage. And the law is, again, going to put her at the complete mercy of this man who was her husband. All of these things show us what people were interested in marriage in the ancient world. And again, we've just looked at a sampling from the laws of Hammurabi, but the ancient Near Eastern law codes are all rife with laws focused on a man providing for his wife, a woman being sexually exclusive to her husband, providing legitimate heirs for the husband, which is why, by the way, we're lumping inheritance laws in with these laws about sexuality and marriage, divorce, and remarriage. They all belong together, right? Because inheritance in the ancient world is one of the major motivators for the marriage laws. Now, we know that these kinds of laws, particularly the laws of Hammurabi, rubbed off on Israel too, and had a huge influence on them, and especially their background in the age of the patriarchs. Let's take as an example what happens in Genesis chapter 16 between Sarai and Abram and Sarai's slave woman Hagar. We remember this story. We're going to make a little more sense of this story today. Turn to Genesis chapter 16. We'll read the first 2 verses. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Right, notice the concern. It's the concern that we've already seen in ancient law, that Abram be provided with a legitimate heir. And Abram mirrors this concern. Right, we would have just read earlier in Genesis chapter 15, where Abram complains to the Lord that he still doesn't have a legitimate heir, that his heir is Eliezer of Damascus. And whenever God offers to to give him promises. He says, what promise could you give me? I don't even have a child to pass anything down to, right? Anything that God could give Abram sees as essentially meaningless because he has nobody to give it to. So Sarai comes up with this scheme to give Abram her slave woman, and to raise up children for herself through this slave woman. Now, where do you think that Sarai came up with that idea? To give her slave woman to her husband to provide an heir. She got it from, well, remember where they are from. Abram and Sarai are both from Ur of the Chaldeans. And you remember who Hammurabi was, where he reigned. He reigned in exactly that area. Let's get a little more Hammurabi under our belts. If a man marries a Naditu, and we'll explain what that means in a minute, and that Naditu gives a slave woman to her husband, and thus she provides children, but that man then decides to marry a Sugitu, they will not permit that man to do so. He will not marry the Sugitu. All right, now this law specifically pertains to priestesses, right? The Naditum and the Sugitum referred to in the text. Right? Those are classes of priestesses. The Naditum were dedicated to Marduk. But it contains the kernel of Sarai's problem, that she's barren. And it does tell us something about the general procedure of things in the ancient world. If a man's first wife is barren, that creates some risk, right? It exposes the married woman to the risk of being sent away or of being supplanted by a second wife. Because generally the ancient laws recognized a man's right to marry another woman if his first wife couldn't provide him children, couldn't provide him heirs. So the solution that Sarai reaches for is taken straight from Hammurabi. Give a slave woman to her husband, securing an heir for her husband, and thereby protecting her position in the household. Because if an heir is provided through a slave woman, the husband cannot take a second wife. And as we'll read later on, the slave woman cannot aspire to equal status with the first wife. Right? In fact, that helps us understand this whole conflict that happens later in Genesis chapter 16 between Sarah and Hagar. Right, let's go ahead and read a little more Hammurabi. If a man marries a Naditu, and she gives a slave woman to her husband, and she, the slave, then bears children, after which that slave woman aspires to equal status with her mistress, because she bore children, her mistress will not sell her. She shall place upon her the slave hairlock, and she shall reckon her with the slave women. Now, remember what happens between Abram, Sarai, and Hagar, and their reactions to all of it. Right? So Sarai has posed the scheme to Abram, and Abram has agreed. This is what happens in Genesis chapter 16, verses 4 through 6. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Right. Hagar holds Sarai in contempt. What we should recognize from this is Hagar's not just being mean to Sarai. That's not the problem in Genesis 16. The problem is she's moving in, right? She is moving against Sarai's status as primary wife, and she is aspiring to equal status with her. And that's why Sarai is outraged at Abram. Right? Have you ever wondered why in this particular story Sarai gets mad at Abram. Like, it's your idea, Sarai. What are you coming to me for? The problem, again, is not just, and look, we should say from the outset, from the standpoint of Christian moral truth, from moral teaching, the relationship between Abram and Hagar is a problem, right? If we're talking from the perspective of ancient law and what Abram and Hagar and Sarai would have expected out of this whole exchange, or the problem, as Sarai sees it, is that Hagar is making a move and Abram is allowing it, right? Sarai's outrage at Abram, right? The Lord judge between you and me, Sarai says, as if Abram has mistreated her. Well, the implication is that Abram is either tacitly or explicitly allowing Hagar greater status than she is entitled to. Right, and we see later on in Abram's story, he shows a lot of favoritism towards Ishmael. Right, by the time that God is ready to provide Isaac to Abram's not particularly excited about it. Right, he would rather have Ishmael as his heir. He sees, at least at the beginning, he sees Ishmael as his legitimate heir. And Abram, for his part, reminds Sarai that Hagar is her slave, and thus her problem to deal with. Remember what Hammurabi prescribes, that because she's born children, she can't send her away, but she can put her in her place, as it were, put the slave lock on her head, count her among the slave women, and so we find Sarai doing exactly that. She treats her harshly. Right, so harshly, in fact, that Hagar runs away. Right, the entire situation makes a whole lot of sense when you understand the ancient context in which these events take place. Again, it's not just Sarai comes up with this harebrained scheme out of nowhere, and Abram goes with it against his better judgment, even though no one else would. And then Sarai is just inexplicably mad at Abram because Hagar is just being mean to her. Like, again, those things don't add up and don't fit in the story as it's presented in Genesis 16. Instead, this all makes complete sense if we recognize that there's a lot of politicking going on here, and that the reason why Sarai does anything that she does in that story is because her position as primary wife is threatened. It's threatened first by her barrenness, and then it is threatened by Hagar conceiving and having this child Ishmael. And Sarai is constantly defending her position as primary wife. Now, the astounding thing is what God does in the midst of all of this. Right? Because this conflict between Sarah and Hagar comes to a head later, right after Abraham and Sarah have received their new names, their changed names, in Genesis chapter 21. After the birth of Isaac, we read this, beginning in Genesis 21, verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned, referring to Isaac. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning, and took bread and a skin of water, and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed, and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. And she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of my child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, and said to her, What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now look at what God does in this whole situation. He takes a very messy situation, and he masterfully protects everyone's interests while untangling the whole thing. He gives Abraham a legitimate heir through whom all of the promises of the covenant will come. Right, and this legitimate heir comes through Sarah. And by doing that, God secures Sarah's position as primary wife. He enables her to conceive. And he also helps Sarah secure her position in the household by telling Abraham to listen to Sarah, listen to your wife, send Hagar away. Right now, as we've seen, that is not what someone in the ancient Near East would be kind of programmed to think is right. Right, because again, the law codes say you don't do that. Or at least the law that was around at Abram's day. So you don't do that. If you have had a child by a slave woman, you have to keep her on. You have to provide for her. She can still be a slave, but you can't get rid of her. You can't sell her off. God says, no, on this one, listen to your wife. Listen to Sarah. Send her away. Isaac is going to be your heir. Right? So Abraham gets the heir that he's wanting. And it's not Ishmael, even though, again, naturally Ishmael would have been the legitimate heir. It doesn't fit God's promise, and so he provides a legitimate heir of his own. And finally, even though Hagar is sent out, and not with the greatest of provisions, God protects Hagar and protects Ishmael by providing her water and establishing a great nation from her son. Now, as we will often see in the Hebrew Scriptures, these stories of marriage are where we see God's mercy on full display. Again, he gets in and he untangles everything and he makes everything work, and again, he shows his love and his mercy in what happens, in what he does. Right? Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael, they may not be showing love in these situations. They might not be showing mercy in these situations, but God does. Now, I want us to return back to the point that ancient marriages reflected ancient interests. Right? We can see these same interests play out in Israel's behavior. Right? We've taken an example from before the law of Moses in Abraham and Sarah. So it was before the law of Moses was given, before Israel was even a nation, before the man Israel was even born. I want us to take a very similar example from a later time, after God had established the nation of Israel and given them the law of Moses. Let's turn our attention now to 1 Samuel chapter 1. We'll read the first two verses. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now the ESV has rendered this a little imprecisely. All right, it says that the name of the one wife was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. What the text actually says is that the name of the first wife was Hannah, and the name of the second Peninnah. That's essential to understand. That Hannah is first wife. She is primary wife. Peninnah is the second wife. Right, and this description should be significant to us now, having read at least a little bit of some of these ancient law codes and seeing what the ancients did, what they were interested in marriage, what made someone an eligible spouse. It's not necessarily common in the ancient world, even outside of Israel, for a man to have more than one wife. Right now, it is common for a man to have concubines in the ancient world, but it is not common for a man to have more than one wife. Monogamy, or at least monogamous marriage, is the norm in the ancient world. Polygamy is accepted under certain circumstances, and it's regulated heavily. We've seen hints of that already from the laws of Hammurabi. And so the hook of 1 Samuel is that once upon a time there was a man who had 2 wives. And immediately we want to know, and an ancient audience would have wanted to know too, why does this guy have 2 wives? Right? It's not normal now, and it wasn't normal then either. Why does this guy Elkanah have 2 wives? That's what makes it a story hook, right? It piques our interest, piques our curiosity. Well, the story gives us an immediate answer, because Peninnah had children, but Hannah, the first wife, had no children. That's how Elkanah ends up with 2 wives. He marries Hannah. She turns out barren. She doesn't provide any children. And so Elkanah takes a second wife, Peninnah, and she provides him with an heir. The ancient context makes complete sense of Elkanah's having 2 wives. Now, let's turn again to the laws of Hammurabi to help explain some more of the ancient context and explain some of the things that we're going to see happen in the story of Hannah and Elkanah. If a man marries a Naditu, and she does not provide him with children, and that man then decides to marry a Sugitu, that man may marry the Sugitu and bring her into his house. That Sugitu should not aspire to equal status with the Naditu. Now, again, this law deals specifically with priestesses. Now, again, those are the technical terms being used. And deals with marriages to priestesses. But the kernel of the problem is there. Right? We read earlier in Hammurabi that if that first wife provides a slave woman to her husband, and he has a child through the slave woman, then he cannot turn around and take a second wife, because his first wife has provided him an heir. Right? Legally, that child belongs to the first wife, even though it was the slave woman who conceived and bore the child. Legally, the child is the primary wife's. But if that primary wife doesn't provide her husband with an heir, through, again, either naturally or through surrogacy, through a slave woman, then at least a lot of ancient law allowed the man to marry a second wife to provide an heir to him, with the provision that the second wife should not aspire to equal status with the first wife, just like we saw earlier that the slave woman who conceives and bears the son should not aspire to equal status with her mistress in the household. But, of course, like we've seen, right, if the law regulates it, it's because it's happening. And in this situation, it's basically inevitable. Right? It is like having the cookie jar open and telling your 3-year-old, don't touch those cookies. Right? What do you think the 3-year-old's going to do? If you bring a second wife into the house, and she's only there because the first wife can't provide children, and she is able to provide children, and you tell her, don't aspire to equal status with the first wife, what do you think is going to happen? Precisely what happened in the case of Sarai and Hagar, and precisely what we're going to see happen in the case of Hannah and Peninnah. All right, this is why Sarah gave her slave to Abraham, to prevent Abraham from bringing in a second wife. And what Sarah feared for herself has come to pass in Hannah's case. Her infertility has led to the introduction of a second wife, and it leads to precisely the sorts of conflict that we would expect. All right, so let's read on in 1 Samuel chapter 1. We'll start in verse 3. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah her husband said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? All right, and we could see, by the way, in this story, not only is this riffing off of, well, not only is it connected to double marriages in ancient Near Eastern law, we can see it riffing off of the story of Sarah and Hagar, and we can also see this riffing off of the story of Rachel and Leah, right? Except some of the roles are reversed, right? So you have a man who takes a wife, and who ends up having to take a second wife, and one of the wives is his favorite. One of the wives provides him children, except in Jacob's case, with Rachel and Leah. The way that plays out, we see it presented as a fault in Jacob's character, right? That Jacob is just attracted to Rachel for her looks, whereas Leah is the one who, over the course of Genesis, turns out to be the better wife by any standard, ancient or modern. She is the better wife. She is the first wife, and so ought to have first wife status and first wife privileges. She is the one that provides heirs to Jacob. It provides the firstborn son. And yet, Jacob prefers Rachel over Leah, prefers the second wife, prefers the barren wife, right? And that whole situation's a huge mess. The story of Elkanah and Hannah and Peninnah it riffs off of that, but it changes the story in some really interesting ways, because now it's Hannah who is the first wife, the primary wife, but she's the barren one, and she's also the godly one, and she's also the favorite one. Right, and we'll see how this plays out over the course of their story. Because this story, just like Sarah's story, just like we saw a minute ago with her and Abraham and Hagar, this story unfolds as a story of God's mercy. The Lord hears the prayers of Hannah. He opens her womb. She conceives and bears a son named Samuel. And Samuel becomes one of the great prophets of Israel, and does a whole lot in God's service. But God, beyond that, uses this whole situation to foreshadow the way that he is going to send his own son, the way that he's going to send the Messiah. Because Hannah is a type of Mary. All right, just look at Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 2. We're not going to read through the text together today, but look at her prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and read it side by side with Mary's song of praise in Luke chapter 1. The similarities, the parallels are just absolutely striking. Honestly, just give you chills to read it. But that's where we're going to stop for today. We're drawing on, about 50 minutes now. I know that this week we have spent a lot less time than usual in the Law of Moses itself, but all of this material lays the groundwork for understanding what the law of Moses is going to do with laws concerning marriage, adultery, divorce, remarriage. We should understand now what motivated marriage in the ancient Near East. And that's also going to tell us a lot about what motivated divorce, what motivated adultery, what motivated remarriage in the ancient Near East. Right? And it all boils down usually to the same things: material security for the wife, right? Having a secure position in the household, being provided for, and legitimate heirs for the husband, exclusive sexual access to his wife, so that the children that she produces are definitively the man's heirs, who will receive his inheritance, which he in turn received from his father. Right? We see those kinds of interests baked into every marriage story and every marriage law in the law of Moses. So again, all of these laws about marriage, about adultery, about divorce, about remarriage, they're all going to come back to these same couple of topics that we see reflected, not just in Israel, not just in the law of Moses, but in the broader ancient Near East. We've seen how those interests could lead people into some very difficult situations, how it can lead them astray. But most of all, we have begun to see how God uses the marriage relationship as a demonstration of his own mercy and love for his people. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to get into the law itself and begin looking at the betrothal process, and, Lord willing, marriage itself, while it was regulated in a marriage under the law of Moses. So until next time, I hope you all do well, and I look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.